So my guest today, Boy George. George, thank you very much for coming down.
Thank you for having us.
You're back with a new single, Amazing Grace. We'll talk about that. But can we start at the beginning? Obviously, the punk roots.
Yeah.
The new romantic movement as well. Kind of quite pivotal to your career, wasn't it? It's quite an exciting time.
Yeah, I mean, it was, it was a time of great adventure for me because obviously I left home and lived in a squat. And I remember sort of when I moved into the squat, my mum and dad kind of drove me there. And they couldn't understand why I didn't want to live at home. They were like, why? Obviously, because, it gave me a lot of freedom, because I couldn't really bring boys back to my parents. So it was a great time for all that kind of thing,
And the artists that you liked musically, like Iggy Pop and David Bowie, and Siouxsie Sioux as well, obviously, who you were friends with and still are today?
Well, I was a bit of a fan, actually, and I used to kind of dress like her for a while. And I went to a lot of their gigs in the early days. But, I know her now, but obviously back then I was just like a fan. I remember she came up to me in a club once and said, "You're the one that dresses as me." Because actually, very funny story, the first time I ever met John Moss, I was at a party at John Conte's restaurant. He was the boxer. And John was working for a film company and they were doing a film on the party and John thought I was Siouxsie. Yeah. And so they approached me to do an interview and I was like, "Oh, I'm not her."
That's a massive compliment though.
And then they realised I was a bloke. So like, I knew I'm not Siouxsie, I'm also not a female. So that's the first time I ever saw John. How weird is that?
Do you remember much about that time? Because obviously it was such a whirlwind, wasn't it? And such a very exciting time, the whole punk scene.
Yeah, I remember. I remember a lot about it. Obviously I wrote a book as well, so I did a lot of kind of research. But I've got quite a good memory. I mean, it's interesting the things you do remember and things that just I don't even remember. Recently I actually heard a song and I didn't even remember writing it, which is the first for me. I was like, where did this come from?
That's probably telling you that you're doing too much. You need to chill out for a bit and not do any work, just switch off completely. Now, of course, you started off as a cloakroom attendant at the Blitz Club, Steve Strange. His club with Marilyn. You used to hang out with Marilyn as well.
All of those characters, yeah. I mean, basically, I think the job at the Blitz was they gave you a free meal. So the idea was like basically to get a free dinner.
I love it.
Because, I mean, these were frugal times, it was lots of, we were all living in squats, so there was no real money around, although I used to go back to my parents all the time to get food, so I was really kind of cheating in a way. But, it was great. I loved it. It was a brilliant time.
Good fun. Do you think you'd be able to relive something like that again? Or do you think that, because times have changed, obviously, since the 80s, I don't think you'll get a movement like it again. Or late 70s.
Well, I don't think you could live in squats like you did back then. Because, I mean, we were there for years, and really nice buildings. I mean, we used to be quite fussy about where we lived. So you'd go around with sort of crowbar and kind of break into places. And, sometimes you got away with it, sometimes you didn't. But I don't think that you're as free to do that now as you were back then,
And Malcolm McLaren picked up on you as well. He caught up on your androgynous style at the time and wanted you in Bow Wow Wow.
Well, actually, it was Matthew Ashman.
Oh, was it?
Yeah,
okay.
Who's now deceased. Matthew was my mate, and he was the guitarist in Bow Wow Wow. And basically, he always wanted me to be in the band. He'd heard me sing a few times, said, "Oh, I wish you were in the band, not Annabella." And Malcolm, because Annabella was this little kid who wasn't really being compliant, she wasn't behaving herself. So Malcolm's idea was to get me in the band because I was a bloke in makeup, so I thought it might threaten her. So really, he just did it to kind of wind her up. Matthew wanted me in the band, and I did about 4 or 5 gigs with them, and then got chucked out, of the band. But Malcolm was Malcolm thought I was a drag act, actually. But after I got famous, he tried to take credit for discovering me, but actually that's not true.
Okay. That's interesting, because you read all this stuff online. And
this is how urban myths are created, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Don't believe what you read in the papers.
But I mean, obviously, when I was a kid, obviously when I met Malcolm, obviously, and I was very impressed by the whole, I did go around telling everyone he was my manager, even though it was only for about 3 weeks.
But that's how Culture Club formed, wasn't it? That's how it all started.
Well, it started because I had loads of friends who were in punk bands, and, most of them weren't great musicians, they weren't particularly good singers, but they had that kind of energy about them, and that's what really inspired me to start the band. I thought, well, if they can do it, I can. And originally, I think the first Culture Club lineup, and we weren't called Culture Club originally, we were called all sorts of things like the Sex Gang Children, In Praise of Lemmings, all sorts of weird names. And I remember John, actually, very early on, John went to LA to visit his relatives, and he sent me a postcard saying, "I don't think the Sex Gang Children is really going to be a good name."
Controversial, I suppose.
Anyway,
no
yes, we'll talk about it when we get back, so he probably knew I'd go mad. But I did agree to change it, obviously.
But there were heady days. I mean, Kissing to Be Clever, a huge success for you as a band.
A surprise success as well, because, round about that time, as I say, everyone I knew was in bands. There was Jeremy Healy was in Hazy Fantasy, all sorts of other bands, Blue Runter, Turk, Spando, all of those bands were getting deals, and we couldn't get a deal. And the reason we couldn't get a deal was because of the way I looked. You know, people used to sort of. A lot of people said I was a drag addict. I remember there was a guy that was the head of RCA, David Betteridge. So I remember him, and he said I was a Vauxhall Tavern drag queen. And I remember when I got my first Brits award back then, I remember sort of going up and tapping him on the head, going, "You were right, weren't you?"
Sweet revenge.
Yeah, I mean, petty, but I mean, back then we couldn't get a deal, and you know, we were the last band to get signed in a way. Back then there was no internet, there was, you know, nothing really. So, but still, it was amazing how things travelled around the country. You know, people knew about. I mean, we were touring, doing gigs then, and you know, we'd had bits of media, but nothing like it is today. And we still kind of got people coming, and went to Derby and this place and that place, and we still got a kind of like interesting little crowd. So, you know, there was a kind of vibe about us before we broke.
To crack the States is quite a big thing.
Well, I remember actually the manager of Spandau Ballet. I was walking down the street one day, right, really early, and you know, we had I think 2 singles out here, and he came up to me and said, "Oh, your record's getting played on the radio in America." And you know, of course, I didn't believe him, you know, because, you know, when you're not, I've never been there. But yeah, I mean, it started getting played on kind of country stations, which was really odd.
Yeah.
And partly because the record company put the single out with no sleeve, so people didn't know what I looked like.
So it's very, very mysterious, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, they were worried that if people saw me, they wouldn't play the record, so it really worked.
Yeah.
You know?
A friend of mine's in a band called Client. You might know her, actually, Sarah. She's been Dubstar. And they started off Client.
Okay.
They started off Client with just shots of their bodies and not their heads. And it was just, you know, created a real kind of
I don't think that would have worked for me, though.
Now, do you really want to hurt me? Obviously, a massive number one, wasn't it? Around the world, like just everywhere. Do you get tired of singing that song now? Is it still quite, you know, close to your heart, that track?
I like that song. I mean, interesting story about that song. When the record company decided to put that out as a single, I was absolutely against it because I was really into dance stuff. And I remember going into Virgin and having a huge row with them about releasing it. This is it, you know, because we'd had 2 singles out. And I thought, if they put this out, we're finished. You know, it's over. And I really kicked up a fuss about it and was like, I don't want this out. Anyway, they overruled me, obviously, and it was a huge hit. So I could have ruined it all.
Yeah. But that surprises me because obviously that sound is still very much prevalent in your work today, isn't it?
Yeah.
That kind of
It was more the
feel.
song, you know, it was more the song. I just thought the song was too personal. So I thought, why would anyone want to hear this? You know, it's just me moaning about my boyfriend. Yeah. But actually, I suppose in a way, what I learned from that is that, you know, the more personal you are, the better it is, really. Yeah. Because you touch people. Like
exactly.
That, you
know. Now, obviously, the mid-'80s is a difficult time for you. You've been very open about, you know, the addiction and stuff. Do you find that difficult to talk about now? Because obviously people will still ask you questions, like myself asking you questions.
People do ask me. I mean, obviously, I've had 2 kind of quite serious drug addictions in my life. The only problem about them is that they kind of, you know, people forget that, you know, it wasn't my whole life. You know what I mean? It wasn't every day. And I didn't actually start taking drugs till I was in my mid-20s. You know, I was really like a nun up to that point. I'd never really smoked. I'd never drunk much. So, you know, it wasn't all of my life. And, you know, people do ask me about it. But it depends what they want to know, you know, what the question is, you know, because obviously, you know, talking about it doesn't really help anyone else, does it? Or me. Yeah.
And again, that time, you know, do you remember much about that despite what you were going through?
I do. I mean, you know, as I said, it wasn't all of the time that was... Because a lot of people think that I was doing drugs in Culture Club, and I wasn't, actually. It was more when the band kind of fell apart that I kind of got into partying and probably had too much time in my hands. Because when I was in the band, you know, it was my life, you know. I mean, I literally lived and breathed Culture Club. And I think when it was removed, you know, my life was completely empty.
Did you feel like you'd lost everything without the band?
Not lost everything, but, you know, I had to find other things to do. And, you know, and of course at that point I was quite successful and I had money. You know, so it was a time when I started going out to clubs in New York and, you know, and discovering kind of, you know, good and bad things, really. So it was all about proximity for me, really. But I suppose in a way, you know, if you're an addict, you know, if you're someone who has an addict kind of nature, eventually, you know, you're going to come across drugs, and that's what happened.
But you bounced back, so career, obviously 87.
Yeah.
Was that quite daunting to actually go out on your own as opposed to with the support from the guys from the band?
It was interesting in a lot of ways because obviously with Culture Club, although we weren't friends before the band, we kind of grew up together. You know, when I when I first the first time I left the country was with Culture Club. The first time I really went to a posh restaurant was Culture Club. Checkbook, all those things were like, I'd never done any of those things before. So, in a way, there was a kind of, it's like we were growing up together. And I think, when I started working with other musicians, I'd had a career, so there was a different type of respect for me. I wasn't arguing about the music with people, and I discovered that actually you could enjoy recording. It didn't have to be a nightmare.
Yeah.
So it was quite, in a way, it was better because, the people I worked with respected me because of my history. So, and I think also because I was more confident, once I started working on my own, I started to learn about the studio, and I developed my own confidence. So, yeah, it was totally different and better in a lot of ways and different because obviously you don't have the other guys to kind of bounce off. You're on your own, sort of thing.
Quite liberating for you.
Yes, yeah, in some ways it was liberating, yeah.